Good afternoon, Honourable Minister, Presidents of ECHE and the Kamra Tal-Periti, ECEC, EMAC and EPO, friends and colleagues, both in person and online. On behalf of the Council of the Kamra Tal-Periti and the Permanent Committee on Engineering, I thank you for joining us today at our mini-conference entitled Beyond Infrastructure. The world is changing, and this could not be more evident as we are still adjusting our lives in the fight against COVID, while never forgetting another pressing issue that is the climate crisis. When we speak about these changes that are happening around us, we, as civil engineers, must keep in mind the definition of urban resilience. This has been defined by the IPCC as the ability for an ecological system to absorb disturbances while retaining some of the basic structure and the ways of functioning, the capacity of self-organization and the capacity to adapt to stress and change. And perhaps it is not only resilience that we should strive for in our infrastructure, but regenerative resilience. Today's conversation with our esteemed guest speakers will merely touch the tip of the iceberg on this subject, with a vision for a future role of civil engineers in society and the construction industry. So here is an overview of what we will be discussing today. In today's conference, we will be touching on the breadth of what a civil engineer's role is within an ever-changing context, from education to urban and marine infrastructure, from governance to planning for net zero cities, and how a civil engineer can be a leader in that change. All the topics that will be discussed today are pivotal for a civil engineering profession, for both young and mature professions, for both existing and new infrastructural projects. So why, you may ask, was the conference called Beyond Infrastructure? Infrastructure enhances our daily life, but it is something that we often forget or take for granted. If we were to take the city as the common denominator, we can easily see what a complex and interconnected place it is, where the different types of infrastructure come together. As Frans Timmermans says, cities are at the forefront of the fight against the climate crisis. Whether it is greening or urban spaces, tackling air pollution, reducing energy consumption in buildings, or advancing clean mobility solutions, cities are often the hub of the changes Europe needs to succeed in our transition to climate neutrality. In fact, the city is one of the most interconnected and concentrated manifestations of water, waste, transport, energy systems, to name a few. And it is this complexity of each individual system that drives some of that bias towards a more of a siloed approach among the designers of a city. We therefore need to break away from the traditional industrial approach where we split a system into parts and to be able to understand it better. As systems get more complex, the danger is that we focus only on one sector at a time, missing out on some of the synergies with other sectors, or those sectors that have unintended consequences to other systems. This approach is what has led us to the cities that we live in today. Looking beyond to what a city can be, if we were to look at it as a system of systems, the strategy of rethinking cities will be about finding synergies across systems rather than working on those detailed set of specifications, while these, of course, still need to be considered. By treating a city as a system of systems, it can help us prioritize interventions in a different way that might be the case when one system is being thought of at a time. Additionally, the cities we live in sit in a great place between the national top-down change that is needed and the influences that individuals, businesses, and communities may bring from a bottom-up perspective. The answer, therefore, cannot be found in one place. The challenge for all those involved in design is an understanding of what cities and city authorities, such as local councils, need from government to help them to respond to climate emergencies, and in turn, understanding that cities themselves can help public authorities in achieving the government agenda. This is a strategic position for civil engineers who ought to envision and strive for infrastructure projects that go beyond what the profession is currently providing. The city infrastructure is the intersection of all built environment professionals and stakeholders. It is high time that the professionals stop working individually, and it is our collective duty as civil engineers to drive this change, a vision that is at heart of the new European Bauhaus. The civil engineer's role in society should therefore go beyond the traditional. It is not solely to design for the health and safety of public and clients. It should be more of an active role and a stronger voice of how design may be done, keeping the engineering perspective in mind from the beginning of a design concept. We need to facilitate partnerships, contributing and combining optimally across assets and skills from both the public and the private sectors. We need to start delivering truly sustainable infrastructure projects that highlight the 3 Ps: people, planet, and profit. And while we're at it, we should possibly add a 4th P, placemaking, while keeping the culture and values of communities for whom we design. Mark Sear says, the only thing holding placemaking back from becoming the norm is often a restrictive mindset, a fearless approach to failure, and the intention of building an environment that promotes health, happiness, and well-being is vital to make it work. We need to challenge this restrictive mindset, because increasing populations have increasing demands that place a much heavier burden on infrastructure, the public sector, organizations responsible for running them, and consequently the public funds available. It can be tempting to jump on the latest trend just to be seen as innovative and not be left behind. But if it does not add genuine value, it will fail very quickly and potentially damage a city. The key to all this and to add this value is for active involvement with the people for whom we are designing. It is no longer a question of the architect or urban designer alone to assume this responsibility. Civil engineers need to be at the forefront of these values and make them work for the community. If we take the people along and make them invested in the process itself will be easier and better, and the community will be proud of it. It is not a question of imposing a project on a community, it is about the community embracing the project, the change happening with them as opposed to happening to them. So placemaking and infrastructure cannot be separated. They give a sense of identity to the city. They reflect the spaces within and do not mitigate the relationship with their surrounding, but enhance it. Carbon itself and its reduction is not the main driver for most people, and there is a need for citizens to be behind the change and understand what's in it for them. This is where we need to start facilitating ideas of co-benefit of a project, in terms of, for example, linking transport and place and energy planning, considering air quality or improved health and safety and well-being. Those are the things that will motivate people. There is the need to look at the problem more holistically and the benefits that may be obtained from them, and then be able to look at it on a more of a systems level to achieve the desired outcome. The solution that gets us to net zero will require a combination of both low carbon technology and societal behavioral change in order to create that uptake. Because it is not just the existence of the electric vehicle or the potential of energy efficient homes, it is the requirement for users to want to have those things and to see that in the long term, it is a more resilient approach. This is where education comes in for all stakeholders in the built environment. We need to start understanding human behavior, something which can go beyond our current setup through collaboration with social scientists. So how can the civil engineer influence decision early on in the planning and design process? And how can he be a big part of the discussion where leadership and innovation occur, such that cities may be able to reach their net zero targets and climate action programs? If civil engineers are serious and actually interested in real change, we will need to do this ourselves. We need to shift from a role of management to one of leadership. During today's program, we will have the possibility of discussing some of these topics, as well as address any questions that you may have from the presentations. This platform is to be an open conversation on how all stakeholders in cities need to move away from thinking about a particular project into thinking how the purpose of the project will drive and respond to the desired outcomes, be they social value, reduction in carbon, equality, diversity, and inclusion, while addressing aging infrastructure and bring about innovative solutions. After all, we are the first generation to feel the effects of climate change, and the last generation to be able to do something about it. Thank you. I would like to greet Honorable Clint Camilleri, who's joining us online, for his intervention at today's conference. We apologize for this delay. The minister will be joining us in a few minutes. I have to reiterate what ECHER president said earlier on. I'm not very good at telling jokes. I'm not even at singing and dancing. So my apologies. Good afternoon, Minister. Thank you for being here with us today.
Good afternoon.
Please have the floor for your speech.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, it is with great pleasure for me to be given the opportunity to address you today during this conference. Climate change is one of the greatest risks of our lifetime, deserving both our utmost attention and urgent action. Prioritizing climate goals in our planning is not only about helping to avoid and mitigate risk, but also seizing opportunities and being at the forefront of the transformation to a net zero world. Fighting climate change has become a top priority to the European Union. Last year, the EU made climate neutrality the goal of zero net emissions by 2050, legally binding across board. It set an interim target of 55% emission reduction by 2030. This goal of net zero emissions is enshrined in the climate law. The European Green Deal is the roadmap for the EU to become climate neutral by 2050. The concrete legislation that will allow Europe to reach the Green Deal targets is laid down in the Fit for 55 package that the Commission presented back in July 2021, and which was again updated a few days ago. The Fit for 55 refers to the EU's target of reducing net greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030. This means that different sectors must contribute to this emission reduction. In order to finance the Green Deal, in January 2020, the European Commission presented the Sustainable Europe Investment Plan, which aims to attract at least 1 trillion of public and private investment over the next decade. Under the investment plan, the Just Transition Fund is designed to support regions and communities that are most affected by a green transition. On our small island of Gozo, we are also working hard to achieve these targets. The Maltese government has set the ambitious target to have Gozo carbon neutral before Malta. In fact, through an application submitted by the Gozo Regional Development Authority, Gozo was chosen to participate in the EU mission 100 climate neutral and smart cities by 2030, a fund under Horizon Europe. Through this mission, Gozo, through the Gozo Regional Development Authority, will receive advice and assistance from the mission platform, consisting of technical assistance and funding opportunities aimed at reaching climate neutrality. Gozo's application was chosen amongst more than 370 applications, with cities and regions chosen based on their strength of their plans and their enthusiasm to achieve the target. As Minister for Gozo, together with other national entities, we are working to achieve this ambitious goal. The recently inaugurated state-of-the-art Hondo Irumin reverse osmosis plant is such one of the examples. From a dilapidated building which was closed down in the 1960s, the government, through the Water Service Corporation, gave life to this site with an investment of 11 million, which plant makes use of cleaner and more efficient sources of energy while providing the island with its potable water needs. We are also adopting the same approach when we came to the design and developing of the engineering works of the new Gozo Aquatic Center and Sports Complex. The project, which has now entered another phase and scheduled for completion by next year, aims to make use of clean energy sources. Presently also, the Gozo Administration Center, which basically also hosts the Ministry for Gozo, is undergoing a retrofitting project to enhance the energy efficiency potential of the building. This will contribute towards the attainment of national greenhouse gases and carbon emissions reduction targets. Among the main measures being implemented are the insulation of the roof, installation of double glazed apertures, and establishment of more energy efficient building systems such as variable refrigerant flow air conditioning systems and heat pumps. Works are also underway on the new park and ride facility at Tashhaima, limits of Shawkia. The new facility aims also to ease congestion and traffic to the Imjar Harbor, as we will be providing free shuttle service using 6 electric buses, fully electric buses, to and from Imjar. In addition, in collaboration also with the Ministry for Energy, we are increasing the charging points around the island to encourage the shift from combustion cars to electrical ones. In fact, as Ministry for Gozo, we are in process of replacing also our fleet to a new electrical one. The biggest commitment of this government remains its electoral pledge that to invest 700 million in the environment over the next 7 years to create green open spaces in urban places. These projects intend to create open parks, urban green reclamation projects, underground parking where possible, green areas spread out all over car tunnels and car-free areas in different localities also at the end of the week. It is in such instances that we as architects and civil engineers are to come up with innovative ideas and solutions to maximize the use of disposable space to the benefit of all. Through this ambitious yet realist target, we can tangibly contribute towards a better quality of life to all our citizens. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Honourable Minister, for joining us today and for your speech. I would like to invite Professor Alex Torpiano for our first presentation today. Professor Torpiano is an architect and structural engineer by profession, having studied in Malta Imperial College under Sir Alan Harris and the University of Bath under Sir Ted Happold. He is Dean of the Faculty for the Built Environment of the University of Malta, where he has taken this position for the last 14 years. He is currently also Executive President of Dean Lart Helwa and the National Trust of Malta. He has served as President of the local Chamber of Architects and Civil Engineers, Kamat al-Periti, and as a founding partner of a private architectural and structural engineering office called TBA Periti. His specialization is in the structural restoration of masonry structures. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Okay, good afternoon. Been introduced. I'm not expecting you to read everything I put on the board, but I thought it would have some color. The colors look better on the iPad, I must admit, but anyway. What I'm going to do is today explain a bit some of the ideas we've had in our faculty in the teaching of civil engineering. I did a presentation on the subject, I think it was also to Eke about 11 years ago, when I was talking about what we wanted to do. And so today I can also tell you what we've done in the meantime. Bit of the background, let's say the profession, sometimes you'll find reference to the term Perit, which is the professional title in Malta. It's actually a derivation of the word expert, and it comes from Italian, basically. So the Perit, even before the formalization of education, was the person who was responsible, who was knowledgeable in the area of construction. Formal teaching of what was then the course leading to the Perit, and I'm using my terminology carefully, was started at the university probably even before 1905. The faculty was set up formally in 1915 as the Faculty of Engineering and Architecture. Engineering and Architecture note. In 1919, we had a new law which regulated the profession, and it was called the Architects' Ordinance. It was based on Great Britain's UK vision of the professions of architecture and civil engineering. Some of you may be familiar that in the UK there is a complete separation up to now, not only at the teaching level, but also at institutional level. And this comes back to the history, and comes back also to the history of why the profession is called civil engineering, because the first title, civil engineer, formally comes from Great Britain. But we had a different tradition, and some of you come from countries that also had a different tradition, especially Central European, East Europe, etc. And that is that the distance between architecture and civil engineering was not that big. We had that tradition. I don't know whether I'm meant to press something else. Ah, okay, but you won't be able to read because it's out of focus. Don't worry. So we started in 2010 with a new program. Previously, we had a 5-year bachelor's degree, which was called Bachelor of Engineering and Architecture. There were differentiations in it. It was not homogeneous for everybody. People could choose specific directions of study within that one degree. But in 2010, also following the Bologna suggestions, we decided to go to a 3+2 process, which we modified by the addition of a year before entry, and I'll explain this later on towards the end of my talk. We have We call it a diploma year, and it's called Diploma in Design Foundation Studies. And this takes students who traditionally and by regulation come from a science background, interested in the disciplines we offer at the faculty, to give them tools which they would not have up to then. I'll say something more about that. Then we have a 3-year course, which is common for all the students who enter the faculty to BSc in Built Environment Studies. Half of it is mandatory, and the other half is based on electives, and which students choose under guidance to eventually join our 2 professional directions, MR, Master in Architecture, and Master in Engineering. I have to explain that in parallel to these developments, with the Camerata Periti, we were also working on legislative changes. And this was an important point, and I'll explain in a minute why. Simply to say today that there is one registration, the profession is regulated, there is a warrant given by the state, but there are, from now on, there will be 2 lists. One of them is the Perite Architect, and the other one is the Perite Engineer Jurídico. And this reflects a bit what is happening inside the faculty, and of course it also reflects in what happens in Europe. May I remind you that in Europe, even in terms of professional recognition, the architects follow a specific route. There is something which is called automatic recognition, while in civil engineers, we don't. And I'll say something about that. In the MEng program, I don't know why I need to press this, because in any case, the screen is out of focus, so I don't know whether you can read that. But you can read it? Fine, okay. So in the MEng cohort, we have, at the moment, we're offering 4, I call them thematics. Basically, there is a Master's Engineering in Structural Engineering, in Civil Engineering, in Engineering and Management, and recently we introduced Building Engineering. Now, we are a small university, but we're also the only university on the island that produces these graduates in the construction industry. So we had to think about the breadth of the profession and how to address the different aspects. So move away from sort of a homogeneous training process to one which allowed change in the context of course, limited resources in a university of our size. So the courses for the MEng program, as I said, we offer 4 thematics or 4 flavors, as if it were, are modular. So basically the changes from the Master's in Structural Engineering to the Master's in Civil Engineering is very subtle. We change modules and retain other modules. But the most important point, I think, in the context of what I want to say today is that throughout the training program, the 2 years of our master's program, a considerable amount of time is devoted to projects, workshops, design projects. And this is a model, of course, that is followed traditionally in schools of architecture. Most of their training, most of their teaching is on the basis of projects. So we have adopted a similar model, also because of our tradition, but also because we believe that a workshop, practice-based, studio-based, ideally, training is a good tool to introduce, let's call them the problem-solving aspects of our profession. So we have, okay, so very briefly, this would be the structural engineering one. So if I go forward quickly, you will see that this module changes, but this one remains, and that one remains. And if I move to the management one, once again, those remain, and we introduce this one. So the idea is to just give them different flavors in accordance with their own aptitude, and this aptitude comes out in the first 3 years, especially in the second half of the bachelor course, where they choose electives under guidance, depending on really where they want to go. And I say this because our experience is that when students come to university at 18 or 19, or at least our students come that early, it's very difficult for them to have the awareness of the breadth of disciplines that are of interest in the built environment. This is our faculty, in the construction industry. So why did we do this? As I said before, the idea of transition from A-level mathematics, physics, science subjects to a wider exploratory education, which is what we expect at university, happens during this diploma year. We introduce all the candidates that want to do any degree, Master of Architecture, Master of Engineering, to subjects that you would not typically find in schools of civil engineering, even though today I see that there is a trend. There are some schools that have introduced, let's call it art in civil engineering. But in any case, the system allows them to understand what the breadth of the professions is and allows them to make a choice, also in response to industry. As I said, the most important point is, I've lost all my formatting in here, but never mind. We believe that the workshop, and especially the workshop, which is done in parallel with students who are following other disciplines. In the bachelor's program, especially in the third year of the bachelor's program, students will generally have made up their mind which direction they want to go, whether it's an architecture or there is civil engineering, with the respective wide fields. We offer 3 thematics in the MArch, so it's just as wide. The students will have also studied the basic subjects that you require in order to be able to gain admission fruitfully to the master's level. So, but throughout the 5-year program, the common theme is the workshop. There's always a practical design exercise that goes on through every semester. And of course, in the last semester of 3rd year, these will be focused on especially structural engineering projects, designing a bridge, designing a canopy, but also urban infrastructure projects. So again, these are at the level of introduction to try to explain what the profession can offer. Why this formula? Of course, I've already referred to the context. Our context comes, as I said, from a tradition which is not the Anglo-Saxon tradition. The Anglo-Saxon tradition from the Industrial Revolution onwards chose to separate, or rather the architects chose to separate themselves from the engineering world. As some of you may know, from the first institution of civil engineers in the UK, all the other engineering institutions evolved: structural engineering, mechanical engineering, railway engineering, whatever. And they still have a structure, an institutional structure that binds them together. So there is a lot of cross-fertilization between all those disciplines. With the architecture schools, it doesn't happen. With the architecture profession, it doesn't happen. With few exceptions. I can think of Leeds, I can think of Sheffield, to a certain extent Bath, where I came from. And I must admit, I've always been influenced a lot in my philosophy through the discussions with Professor Happel there. But the most important point is that in reality, when you come out of university, you need to work with all these disciplines. You need to work with other disciplines. And therefore, at some stage, you need to have some common denominator, some common language. I believe that the distance between architecture and civil engineering is artificially wide. I have been to conferences on teaching of structural engineering recently, about say 5 years ago. I was in a conference where people were talking about what they needed to do to update teaching of structural engineering, and they were actually talking, there were some leading engineers who do it in their practice, they were talking about teaching structural engineering students how to draw. And there was a big, almost a surprise in the hall, to the extent that one of the participants at a certain stage asked the presenter, he told him, so we're becoming more like architects. And the answer was, and this was Professor Tim Eibel, so it's not somebody who is unknown in the industry. He said, yes, in the end, that is what is required, because our basic objective is to find solutions. And to be able to express solutions, you need certain tools which go beyond the mathematics and go beyond computer analysis. But the other point that I think is important to emphasize is that the the discipline, even within conventional civil engineering courses, the range of disciplines is enormous and changes. So we have two choices. We can either have specialized courses immediately for each of those disciplines, or we have a system which grows. So you choose a certain, use the common parts of your training to choose a generic direction, and then eventually grow into the specializations. And we find, or at least I find, that our system allows us greater flexibility, especially in the master's level, to introduce or remove in response to industry, in response to what is happening outside our walls as a faculty. Okay, so this is a bit useless, but I think the point I want to make, which is something I discovered, is that there is precedent. In 1981, there was a committee of ministers of the Council of Europe, discussion on the education process, and they made recommendation on the specialized training of, and I quote, architects, town planners, civil engineers, and landscape designers. And in this recommendation, it was suggested that the educational objectives for all of these four disciplines should be stimulating thought and hence inculcating a new philosophy of the environment, with particular reference to architecture and natural heritage, including social aspects. 1981 now, no? So this is not concerned with Green Deal or not a concern with climate change. This is 1901 foresight, you may say. They're talking about these disciplines concerned with their own areas, but which ought to have a common interest, as I've described, as I just quoted. And also, second bullet point, creating an understanding of and respect for the various scientific disciplines relating to the environment and to its importance as a framework for living conditions. And the third point, which is one I have just hinted at, preparing for cooperation, notably by means of joint exercises throughout the training period. The committee proposed that a common core should be established for university studies in the four disciplines directly concerned by, without prejudice to the specific character of studies in each discipline. And the objective of this was to make clear that any action involving one of those disciplines is but partial and belongs to a general pattern. To foster the adoption of a common language for the various participants in order to create an atmosphere of interdisciplinarity and clarity, which is often lacking at the moment. And this was suggested that this could be achieved by arranging the basic educational subjects into three families: modes of perception of space, history of heritage and of civilizations, and the relationship between man and his environment. 1981, I repeat, that is foresight, and I don't think many schools or many countries actually took up that recommendation. We have come close with our changes in 2011. But I want to say something about the common training framework for civil engineers. Some of you may have been involved. There was an attempt in 2016, 2017 to try and work out some sort of common framework. There was a report commissioned by the European Union. And the objective of this, the ultimate objective of this, was to achieve automatic recognition for civil engineers in the same way as architects have automatic recognition throughout the EU zone, or beyond, in fact, even the AAE zone. And well, the report that was presented in 2017 admitted that although there were many points of agreement, consensus, it was still, they were still far away from consensus on a common framework of training for a number of reasons. Some of them institutional, some of them cultural, carrying the baggage from the tradition of their own countries, and also some concerns about, let's call it, the interference of a central framework, etc., etc. But in the same report, and here I really would like you to see them, there are 10 points. There are 10 points which are suggested as a framework for discussion for a common framework. They hadn't given up. They said, look, on these 10 points, we probably can agree to build something. I don't know that anything has happened since 2017 on this. But the choice of 10 points is very significant. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Directive for Mutual Recognition of Professions, but the architecture world has 11 points. And the 11 points are in the directive. And for you to have automatic recognition, every faculty must make sure that each one of those 11 points are tackled in some way in the studies over a 5-year period. And I thought this was very intriguing because they seem to be trying to do the same thing. Mind you, what they must not forget is that to arrive at a consensus on the 11 points took more or less a couple of decades. So even though the architect's directive was one of the first directive at European level and then was absorbed in the other ones, but that took a long time. But here this committee was proposing 10 points, and I went through these 10 points because I know the 11 points very well. And I was saying, basically, these are really saying the same thing in slightly different language. There are actually, with some exceptions, of course, but they're all concerned with urban, rural space, the environment, proper level of safety, history, the place of the professional in society. Jeanette earlier was talking about the social role. I think to a certain extent, most civil engineering courses that I've seen forget about the social role of civil engineers, which is certainly increasing in importance. How to do the business part, how to manage a project, how to understand, very interesting. This is practically word for one of the points in the architect's directive. Understanding the relationships between people and buildings and the environment influencing human relations. What am I trying to say here? And let me find another one. Understanding the profession of civil engineers in serving society. I can assure you that there is one in the directive Leading with Architects which says understanding the profession of architects in serving society. Exactly identical. So the question is to have adequate knowledge about the building industry. Exactly the same in the 11 points for architects. So the question I want to say is, in fact, I even have it here, but of course you won't have time. Why are we so apart? Why do we find it so strange that we believe that the structure of our minds as civil engineers, and therefore the educational processes as civil engineers, should be significantly different from the structure of people who do architecture and therefore the training of architects. But the point I want to make is that even if you do look at all the 11 points, in the case of engineers, the 10 points, my question is whether it is enough to create the professionals of the future. Because, and I always say this to my students, the importance of terminology. If I asked a student today, what do you think the profession of architect is, and what do you think the profession of civil engineer is? And they will tell me, I'm sure, the architect is the creative person, the one who invents, and the civil engineer is the one who makes things work, okay, makes the calculation, makes the mathematics work. If you look at the root of the words, the meaning of the words is the exact opposite. The architect is the master builder, the one who knows how to build. And the engineer, well, the engineer comes from ingenio, and comes from invention, comes from, I mean, and I like the Italian term of genio civile and the French term génie civil. And I also noticed as I was sitting down, it's also in our logo here, arte et ingenio. So the point is, what are we doing to foster the creativity part beyond the transmission of knowledge? What are we doing to foster the creativity part? Now, what we've done is to introduce, that's why I mentioned earlier this diploma, which is basically a course of 1 year, which teaches students how to draw, how to use color, how to take photos, how to make models, how to take photographs, how to print. You know, it's almost a first year for an art course. And a lot of people ask me, but why? But the reason is twofold. First of all, because it teaches you the tools that you need to communicate, and civil engineering is a lot about communication of ideas, communication of details, combination of concepts. And two, it allows you to start looking at the world in a different way. which is how you generate the, and I'm not inventing this myself. There is a paper here which is from Princeton University, and what he says is the concepts normally attributed to visual art, beauty, psyche, idiosyncrasy, uselessness, come to bear on civil engineering students as well. The other paper, teaching artist engineering students, a bit too long to talk about it by Harry Partridge, but it refers to the school, University of Sydney. But my favorite one is, of course, from Ted Happold, and this is one which I use also in my faculty. A world which sees art and engineering as divided is not seeing the world as a whole. So basically, some things to think about. This is what we do. It's not perfect, and we continue evolving. But I think as a profession, we need to think a bit more where we want to go with our education process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Turkana, for that contribution. A lot of food for thought, which I'm sure later on in the discussion panel, we'll be able to take some of the topics a little bit further. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Gatt, who is joining us online today. Dr. Gatt heads...
Yes.
Hi, Dr. Gatt. Thank you for joining us today. A brief introduction. Dr. Kevin Gatt heads the Department of Spatial Planning and Infrastructure at the University of Malta. He specializes in resource governance and in particular water and waste management. He has an extensive experience in water, waste, environment, and sustainable development policy, having worked for many years in the public administration. Thank you for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Before I take the floor, Janet, I need to be able to be given rights to share my screen, which is not appearing at the moment.
Thank you for drawing us the attention. So we'll be looking at that. Yes, I think you'll be able to share now.
Yep, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I would have liked to be with you physically, but circumstances have dictated otherwise. The thematic I have chosen dovetails very well with what Janet and Alex have mentioned, particularly that the civil engineer's role goes beyond traditional infrastructure, and the fact that not only should engineers become more architects in themselves, but architects should become more engineers in themselves, and engineers should become more infrastructural engineers, and architects should become also more of infrastructural engineers. Why do I say this? I say this simply because the motivation or the inspiration which has underpinned this presentation comes from my pro bono role as a member of the qualifications panel of the Chartered Institute of Water and Environmental Management of the UK, which awards chartered status to professionals wishing to exercise the engineering profession. And one of the things that struck me most, and which perhaps my colleagues have already elicited, is to what extent have we not considered the societal impact of the engineer? Because if we look at the learning outcomes of the AHEP, which governs what an individual should have in order to achieve charter status, one particular section is precisely the engineer and society. And if you allow me to quote, it says that engineering activity can have a significant societal impact. And on this, I don't think we should have any doubt. And that engineers must operate in a responsible and ethical manner, recognizing the importance of diversity and help ensure that the benefits of innovation and progress are shared equitably and do not compromise natural environment or deplete natural resources to the detriment of future generations. So here, if we had to sort of take out the key factors, this statement is talking about the ability of the civil engineer, the ability of the engineer to understand what sustainability is, to have a flavor of economics, of finance, of social well-being, as well as environment, to understand that there are ethics involved in how we consume our resources without depleting them irreparably for the future. There are issues of security, equality, equity, and all these are very much enhanced in or enshrined in what the governance parameters truly ask us to take into account, because I believe that governance is the genesis or the upstream end of what is actually manifested on site. So yes, we all think we know what governance is. We've seen governments in action, and therefore we know what governance is. We may have our thoughts, we may have our beliefs, but what governance really is something by which the state leads society forward. And if infrastructure is not a vehicle which leads society forward, then I don't know what is. If we look at water, if we look at transportation, if we look at energy, these are key infrastructural elements without which society would not be at the level of progress, at the level of advancement, at the level of innovation that it is today. And this is something which the state is delivering a service to citizens, whether it does it on its own steam or whether through some form of privatization or some form of public service organization. When we look at all this infrastructure, it is evident that there are so many stakeholders that unless we understand the needs and interests of these stakeholders, the end result will certainly not match up to expectations. When we talk today about stakeholders, stakeholders do not expect consultation documents. Stakeholders expect a government to approach them with a blank sheet of paper and to chart the way forward together. Nonetheless, the state has its powers. In a democratic society, the state is formed by the government which is elected on the day, and with it comes the power to manage economic, social, and environmental resources. And therefore, at times, infrastructure and the environment find themselves as the sort of silent partners within what governments focus in order to try and maximize socio-economic good, because there is this feeling that socio-economic good can be felt. Today, we are more than aware, the scientific evidence is what it is, that we are reaping what we have sowed in the past. Climate change is with us. And climate change is drastically changing behaviors of nature, which same behaviors have to be managed through our infrastructure, whether it is an increased demand for power, whether it is an increased requirement for storage of floodwaters, or whether it is the interchange which we are about to embark from the internal combustion engine to electric vehicles. Nonetheless, governance remains something which is highly political. But it is only good governance which leads to sustainable development. We can have the best socio-economic matrix. But if we have to assess it from a sustainability point of view, if the environmental pillar is not maximized in the same way that the socio-economic pillars are, then sustainable development will not prevail, and the consequences will be felt by present and future generations. We are definitely better off from a socio-economic standpoint than our forefathers. But the question is, are we better off from an environment and resource perspective. Then we come to infrastructure governance, which is an offshoot of governance, but which is based on the same principles. It is about who gets what, when, and how. Today, we live in a society where expectations are very high, and I get what I want, when I want, and how I want. That is not something which is often possible. It could be populist, but it is definitely not sustainable. And therefore, this is why we need infrastructure-related decision-making that is made and administered in the light of competing demands. Infrastructure takes land, and therefore the competition for land, particularly in the country where we are holding this workshop, which is limited, definitely land is one of the competing uses. And therefore, do I allocate land for building, or do I allocate land for green infrastructure? Do I allocate land for gray infrastructure, or do I make the move to greener infrastructure? And these choices are not easy to make. They require strong institutions, they require good regulation, and they require a knowledge of the demands which society is exerting. So good governance is about the role of the state and stakeholders. Today, we are beyond autocratic governance. Today, we are in an era of participative governance. And therefore, as engineers, in whatever role we manifest our profession, we have an obligation, or we should have a moral obligation, to contribute to the overall governance of our infrastructure, without which the economy will collapse, society will collapse, and therefore we have problems. So what I'd like to do is to look at these parameters for good governance and pose a few thoughts about each parameter and how the engineer can have a role. The engineer can have a role either through formal institutions, but the engineer can also have a role from a civil society aspect. First and foremost, it's all about political will and vision. We need to understand where a government wishes to move, but we do have the opportunity to influence that direction. Today, governments do not work in isolation. And therefore, when they are preparing their electoral program, it is a golden opportunity for engineers, for bodies representing engineers, to have a direct input into shaping that electoral program. Because once a government is elected, that electoral program becomes its mandate. And once it becomes a mandate, which the public has voted in, then it needs to be respected. And it needs to be respected by the people who formulate policy, the people who implement regulations, and it will also shape how the opportunities for professionals will unfold. And therefore, we need to ask ourselves, to what extent are we ready to be firm yet just? Are we still on the road to maximizing the use of land? Or do we realize that any form of development has an environmental impact? And it is our obligation to neutralize any negative environmental impacts so that we are not taking from society that which is not ours. And therefore, when we contribute to the workings of government, we are contributing to political direction. We are contributing to the collective will of government and to the individual will of those ministries which represent the various infrastructural sectors. We do not have a ministry for infrastructure, but a lot of our infrastructure is distributed in different ministries. And therefore, we need to understand and dovetail the workings of these ministries. Communication today has become fundamental. And we need to recognize how to communicate, who our audience is, and what media our audience understands. The prime time advert before we have the 8 o'clock news, not the 9 o'clock news, is something which is passé, or at best, which applies to a limited cohort of the audience. Today, social media is also stratified, with certain platforms appealing to youth more than others. So our language, our message needs to be imparted, not in a way that we understand, not in a way that everyone understands, but it has to be imparted in ways and means by which our different audiences, which we have identified, can understand and be attracted to. And this is done regularly. It is done through different channels. It has to be done in a professional manner. And it has to be proactive. We cannot wait for a particular sector of society to kick up a fuss about something which is not working properly. We need to anticipate where we are going. Which brings me to coherency. How coherent are we in our design? How coherent are we in our knowledge of how development impacts the economy, the social sector, and the environment? We need to acknowledge that the action of development will impact other sectors, and we have to neutralize those negative effects. One thing which I like to say to our students is we need to engineer our solutions in a way which mimic nature. And today we have the tools to do it, we have the knowledge to do it, and we now need to translate all that onto the ground. We cannot go on a Robin Peter to pay Paul type of attitude. I will introduce electric vehicles, but I don't have sufficient energy demand to power electric vehicles. Do we plan sufficiently that when we are introducing such a great reform, we now know that the cutoff date is 2035, but are we planning the parallel infrastructure that requires, for example, this transition to electric vehicles? We talk about green infrastructure. Are we willing to amend our planning laws? Are we willing to allocate that land which is required in order to neutralize the impact that development is causing? And if we are there in the formulation of a government's manifesto, then our alignment with government policy becomes very easy. It's hand in glove because the work has been done, and that is our contribution to society. Obviously, as engineers, we need to ensure that no one is left behind. We need to look at equity, not equality. And one thing which I, for example, am against is that we have a system here in Malta whereby every resident gets a subsidy or a preferential rate on the first 33 cubic meters of water which that person consumes. Now that equates to the average water consumption per capita in Malta. And that is equality. Are we happy with equality, or are we supposed to be moving towards equity, where subsidies are there to be shouldered by those who can afford in order to help those who cannot afford or who are at risk of poverty? We need to ensure that everyone has the right to voice his opinion. There are certain institutions which have firepower. They have resources. But there are other organizations which are timid, which do not have resources, yet they represent such an important user of a particular infrastructure. I remember doing a social network analysis of the actors involved in the Maltese water resources system. And lo and behold, I found that the agricultural sector is the most distant sector from decision making. When the agricultural sector thrives on water and exerts an appreciable demand. So how can we not understand their needs, their requirements? We talk about inclusivity, and therefore no one should be deprived from infrastructural services. I'm proud to be from a country which has a coverage of the sewage network, which is almost 100%, which has a water network which covers 100%, which is the first country in the Mediterranean to treat all its sewage before disposal. But that is the macro level. We need to ensure that at the micro level, where infrastructural services impact the individual, no one is deprived from the basic use of that infrastructure. And that is why there is the concept of solidarity, the concept of proportionality, because this is ethical behavior, whereby we recognize the need to support those who are in difficulty and not to pilfer that which is not ours. The rule of law is not about having a compendium of printed laws. Infrastructure, if we look at the various sectors of infrastructure, be it water, waste, be it transportation, regulatory instruments are wide-ranging. We are a member of the European Union, and therefore we are obliged to transpose the directives issued by Brussels. But it is not about transposing or cutting and pasting the directive into Maltese legislation. It is about how fairly, how equitably do we then implement, enforce these regulations. The worst thing to do to a regulation is not enforce it. It kills it. And when you try to bring it back into force, you will not have to climb a hill, but you will have to climb a mountain. Rule of law is there to resolve conflicts, and conflicts will always exist. Whether there are those individuals who don't want a new road passing through their fields or adjacent to their properties. Whether we have the developers, for example, who wish to develop more, be it onshore and offshore. And then we have the environmentalists who are up in arms saying, no, this is too much. And that is why rule of law needs to allocate resources. Particularly Malta is a very interesting case study. Because of our size, our resources are very finite. And unless we go towards a system where we recognize they are finite, we recognize what sustainable consumption of such resources is permissible, then we can never have appropriate allocation of resources. And the allocation of resources is not about not allowing people to exert their development potential, but it is about responsibilizing people to use resources in a sustainable manner. We talk about capacity. I have worked in the public administration for many years. And one of the things which was always difficult to achieve was the difference between policy, regulatory, and operation functions. Sometimes we had operational bodies, because of lack of capacity, who were the policy advisors to the minister. Obviously, there is bias. Or if you have a regulatory entity who is providing advice to the minister, that is bias. So there is a lot of space, there is a lot of room for engineers to fill roles within these three pillars. which characterize how development is charted from its genesis to its realization. So it's about having qualified personnel, about having the right financial resources, about having the technical resources, but it's also about the formal training, which Professor Torpiano has eloquently explained. But training doesn't stop once we graduate or once we obtain our warrant. We need to have continuous professional development. And the chartered engineer status requires us to have an annual continuous professional development program to keep us relevant. We would have never thought of discussing governance 30 years ago. But today we need to raise the flag of governance if we are to ensure that the end result is something which is sustainable. Again, participation. The social partners need and expect to participate in decision making. But do we make it easy? Are we interested ourselves? Because we cannot always criticize government, say, government did not consult us. Or government issued something which is a fait accompli. How much do we actively seek to participate when decisions are being made, when policies are being formulated? And it doesn't have to be on the eve of an election, but government is developing policies all year round, all through its mandate. How do we respond promptly to issues? If we are requested to help government, do we act quickly? Obviously, governance is a two-way road, or it's a tango, and it takes two to tango. Government must be responsive, but we must be amenable as well. And again, for those in the private sector, what are the opportunities for professionals in the private sector to influence, to shape the governance of infrastructure? Governance is about transparency. And therefore here we have perhaps the advantage that our technical knowledge enables us to scrutinize what is being done. To what extent do we undertake this scrutiny and tell government, listen, we think that you could have done a better job here and there? How accessible are we to do this pro bono work for government as an institution, as an individual? Do we understand the operations and how they work? Do we understand how tariff structures work and how government goes about setting tariffs? Do we contribute towards shaping of such tariffs? But when we contribute to decision making, to consultations, do we just look at the engineering dimension, or are we able to have a three-dimensional view? A three-dimensional view which is based on economic, social, and environmental consideration. One of the words which I hate is accountability, because accountability has a perception of a definition which is totally incorrect. Accountability, many people, if you ask many people what accountability is, they will say it's putting your head on the block and chopping it off. It's not about that. Accountability is about setting lines of responsibility, understanding who's responsible for what. And if there are mistakes, it doesn't mean that that's the end of the line. But accountability means that you assume that responsibility and take it upon you not to repeat it in the future and to take the action to correct what could have been done better. This leads to efficiency and effectiveness. And that is why peer reviews and benchmarking are two important tools. And institutions and individuals, I would say, are very well poised to be able to carry out such exercises in collaboration with government, but they must put up the flag and create awareness on the need for such instruments in order to have better infrastructural governance. All this leads to sustainability. Unfortunately, it's a word which is used as a prefix and sometimes in a meaningless form. We can see a number of examples where solutions which have not maximized in economic, social, and environmental goals, and ergo are not sustainable, have failed. Unless we look at whatever we do from an economic and social and environmental perspective, it's more of the same. I might say, but a developer, a company is there to maximize shareholders' wealth. True, that is the classic definition. But today we are not living in isolation. Today we are living in a society where a knock-on effect from one area has an impact on the other. And therefore, this is very important in terms of training. To what extent does the training of our engineers make them not economists, not sociologists, not environmentalists or environmental scientists, but makes them aware of what ticks in the economy, of what constitutes social well-being, and what are the environmental resources. And therefore, this is how I like to depict these parameters. That not only are they in a snooker type of triangle tied together, but even that triangle is binding all the parameters together so that they are one whole, and we cannot have any one of those parameters being divorced from the rest. Unless we maximize, unless we factor all these parameters, then our governance will not be as robust as it should be. So to conclude, there are a few questions which may be points to ponder today, hopefully even tomorrow. How effective and holistic are professional bodies in contributing to better infrastructure governance? Is infrastructure governance just something of an engineering input, or are we capable of having other disciplines which we know about and can factor? To what extent are we factoring governance in our learning programs in order to produce professionals who are sensitive to this issue? Is engineering still a number crunching discipline, or can we broaden it to understand better economic, social, and environmental goals and impacts? And to what extent are professional bodies respected by governments and also by their members? I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your intervention, Dr. Gatt. That has raised a lot of interesting points, and I'm sure there will be many questions later on to tackle in the Q&A and discussion panel later today. So I'd like to invite Parit Jobujaya on the stage now. He'll be talking about the role of the civil engineer in future maritime industry. And as a brief introduction, Parit Jobujaya is a civil engineer and architect by profession, and he obtained his MA in civil engineering at Imperial College London. For 4 decades, he worked at the Malta Freeport, becoming its general manager and later its director of projects. This track record has given him extensive experience in terminal development and infrastructural works in ports and harbors around the world. Presently, he is the lead partner of his firm, Jobujaya Associates, which specializes in maritime and civil engineering projects. He is also a visiting lecturer at the University of Malta. Thank you for being here with us today.
Green forward.
Good afternoon. When one tries to look into the past for the future, an analysis of where one is coming from is essential. This is true for all industries, and the maritime industry is no different. Luckily, Malta has an amazingly rich historical context in the maritime industry. It is no wonder that Malta has a wealth of historic port protective structures, berths, docks, warehouses, books, prints, maps, and old photos one can continually refer to in order to appraise the past. Considering Malta's successful historic maritime projects makes one shudder at the unenviable challenges that civil engineers have to face in the future to maintain the high standards of its maritime tradition. Maritime developments in Malta have been evident throughout history, ever since the Roman harbor at Marsa. The Romans engineered a seamless infrastructure below and around the Jesuits' Hill, including berths and warehouses. The Knights of St. John, in turn, developed ingenious maritime logistics and galley facilities, mainly in the south side of the Grand Harbor. Later came the British civil engineers, who, together with leading Maltese representatives, had a great vision. Together, they developed a new commercial port at Marsa and transformed the French Creek into a world-class naval base. Their technical skills, their analytical studies of the Maltese waters, their geotechnical evaluation at seabed level, their construction logistics and plant, and their distinction between planning the commercial port as distinct from the naval engineering base were fundamental in giving the Maltese harbors stature and dedicated usage. Following independence from the British, the 50 years that followed saw Malta consolidate its harbors by following their original British zonal allocation. However, these developments became peppered with yacht marinas springing up here and there according to commercial convenience. It was during these last 50 years that one has to recognize the successful development of the Marsa-Shlock transshipment freeport, spot on where Lord Strickland had envisaged it in the 1930s. The freeport has brought sustainable economic activity of international standing. One thing is comforting throughout history. Maltese artisans, civil engineers, and technicians work together with their foreign counterparts to produce sound maritime infrastructure. Thus, the challenge beckons the Maltese civil engineers to continue to discharge their future maritime profession with diligence and creativity. If the Camera Talperiti civil engineers are to project themselves for the requirements of future years, what scenario would provide the maritime civil engineer the environment to optimize the professional practice? Is the present maritime authority administratively made to function within the wider transport authority, whilst the marine engineering separated within the wider autonomous infrastructure Malta? A good setup for the marine civil engineer to develop his profession. The marine engineer has to operate within a wholesome maritime environment to optimize his knowledge and vision. It is hoped that a soul-searching exercise will yield a structure where civil engineering can be adequately established within a maritime authority set up in order to be able to participate and contribute to development of the maritime infrastructure. Maritime infrastructure and its supporting landside logistics need continuous planning strategy review for the future civil engineer to keep a sharp lookout on the fulfillment of the role. The latest official planning document, SPED, which is the Strategic Plan for the Environment and Development of 2015, mentions the evident conflicts regarding coastal use. Both thematic and coastal objectives of the same SPED mention sensible, generic statements that are valid at textbook level. However, the documents do not elaborate sufficiently into the guidelines as to how prioritization of activities are to take place within the same zoning. There needs to be more guidance at national planning level for the civil engineer to have clear visibility on the design process. The planning scenario on the supporting landside logistics also needs clarification. In fact, local haulage companies can establish their inland depots all over the island. This creates traffic congestion beyond the port areas, depending on the intensity of port activity at any one time. The sorting of this issue would enable the future maritime civil engineer to become an active participant within a logistically structured planning process. Another major issue that the maritime engineer will be addressing in the future is nature itself. History has shown that whatever is man-made has to be respectful of nature. The builders of the Marsa Roman port 2,000 years ago seemed oblivious to the siltation and flooding in low-lying marshlands. Archaeological research has given light to what was justly attributed to distant history. How will the future maritime civil engineer plan his design criteria so as to ensure durability of the maritime infrastructure? Luckily, science and technology today has built up a marine wave hindcast that civil engineers need to be conversant with when planning and designing future development. Nature is being monitored because of climate change, and extrapolation of records assist the civil engineer in setting long-term design criteria for marine structures. In fact, design offshore wave height from hindcast data gathered in the last 50 years and reconciled with more recent satellite data show surface wave heights varying from 6 to 8 meters, depending on the direction of the storm. Combined wind wave data show gust recordings of 40 meters per second for a duration up to 10 seconds, which then leads us to what prediction of rise in sea level due to climate change. Tidal ranges in the Maltese waters has gone up 1 meter from the lowest to the highest astronomical tide in the last few decades. On top of that, a predicted sea level rise of 0.5 meter in the next 50 years seems to be a reasonable value to take during the setting of design criteria. These criteria are then superimposed on the mathematical models that have, for most ports and harbors in Malta, been developed. Any proposed location within the major ports and harbors would have its characteristic design wave height corresponding to the wave penetration pattern in the model. Proving of the structural design may be obtained by subjecting it to physical flume tests, if the case would require it. Typical wave penetration pattern for Marsa Mshet Harbour shows the tools available for the civil engineer. Another important aspect that has to be addressed for the future civil engineer to be better equipped to exercise the profession is the diffused and scattered state of education and training in the marine infrastructure industry. The last 50 years of maritime development enjoyed the workmanship qualities and engineer grammar of the former apprentices of the British dockyard. With the military rundown in the 60s and 70s, many marine engineers, shipwrights, and technicians from the docks became excellent teachers in the secondary schools and tertiary educational institutions. This helped to maintain a generational flow of technically competent persons in the industry. Being an essentially maritime-oriented country, the traditional settlements located within the hub of the Grand Harbour commercial activity, particularly those of the three cities, Marsa and Ormi, provided the skilled manpower and supported the maritime activity, including its infrastructure. The future maritime civil engineer needs to have the support of the educational institutions which will encompass all aspects and levels that the industry will require. Institutions such as the Malta Maritime Forum, the Malta University, MCAS, and Malta Marittima can go a long way in helping to close educational gaps. Otherwise, how can the civil engineer deliver his best without supporting staff trained as surveyors, hydrographers, marine construction workers, engineering divers, construction barge operators, and many other skills and trades related to marine infrastructure? The marine civil engineer himself needs to have a wider professional preparation as well. The civil engineering preparation has to include Malta's marine archaeology, the historic developments of Malta's ports and harbors, coastal characterization, local wave studies, wave break forces, and beach behavior in parallel with the standard coastal studies. This leads one to determine what needs to be taken into account to enable the civil engineering profession to make any profound contribution to the maritime industry in the future. Assuming all three requisites of administration, planning, and education already mentioned are tackled successfully, the step to follow will be that of the greater participation of the civil engineers themselves. Having been well-groomed in the maritime idiom, it would only be a question of time before the civil engineers' creativity and boldness start impacting. At that stage, the Camera Talperiti can claim statutory civil engineering representation on the various maritime authority, planning authority, and education authorities. Certainly, the presence of a strong civil engineering lobby in a top-notch multidisciplinary team can lead to successful national maritime strategy. Valid, sustainable, and economically viable maritime strategies will certainly follow. They would be of the standing and the durability of the brilliant Marsa Commercial Port project of 1850, or the naval docks of the 1880s, or the Grand Harbor breakwater of 1910, or the Mjar Harbor of the 60s, or the Freeport of the 90s. Hopefully, the local future civil engineers should be fully participant in the planning process to develop a holistic national maritime infrastructure master plan that the country adopts for its long-term strategy in order to have dedicated coastal zoning for quality designs and sustainable activities that are nature-friendly. Hopefully, the future Camera civil engineers will join multidiscipline teams to design environmentally advantageous land reclamation projects that serve the maritime industry rather than the landside development speculators. Hopefully, the next generation of civil engineers would be planning appropriate offshore protective structures that host yacht marinas to liberate our beautiful creeks from the regimented cluttering of pontoons and rigging masts. Hopefully, the future civil engineers would create and plan port logistics and warehousing within contiguous port hinterland zones and liberate the present warehousing dispersed all over the island. Hopefully, the future civil engineers can plan to replenish large beaches throughout Malta's coast and create similar beach extents, such as the one at Pretty Bay in Birzabucha that was created in 1991. Hopefully, the future civil engineer will be actively participating in the maritime research and development, addressing climate change and ribbon coastline development pressures by speculators. Hopefully, yes, and so many more maritime project necessities that should overtake in the future the present speculative buildings along waterfronts. The Camera Talperiti should take up this challenge for its own civil engineers of the future. May we start paving the way forward for the good of our future engineers as well as our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Farid Boujeya, for your intervention. I would like to now introduce Farid Godwin Sultana. Farid Sultana graduated from the Lawrence Technical University in Michigan and later at the University of Paris, and was admitted to the Architecture Honor Society Tau Sigma Delta. In his first architectural opportunities in the United States, he worked with Wah Yi and Sarah Naki Associates Architects. I hope I pronounced that correctly, apologies. And upon his return to Malta, he was part of a small design team with AOM on the Manuel Island and Thnia project. Godwin now has his own private practice, Architectural Volume. His experience on design projects range from interior detailing, industrial and residential, marketing plans, product, urban master planning, commercial and retail design. He is here on behalf of the Ministry for GOZO, and he will be talking to us about GOZO reaching net zero by 2030. Thank you.
just practice the clicker here for a second. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to talk, as stated, I'm here to talk about the net zero goals for the island of Gozo. I am part of a team for the Ministry for Gozo under the Strategy and Support Division that works closely with EcoGozo and have been working with them for quite a few years now, since 2007. So part of that team as well. Gozo, the Ministry for Gozo, it's a peculiar organization or a part of government. It's a peculiar ministry in the sense that in Gozo, the ministry takes care of a lot of different sectors. We range from counting how many eggs a chicken lays to multi-million infrastructure. So it is a very peculiar thing that everything falls under the umbrella. In Gozo, everything falls under the umbrella of the Ministry for Gozo. This provides a unique opportunity for us, though. It provides an opportunity for us to understand the different dynamics in terms of everything, from the social aspect, from the economy aspect, touristic aspect, and infrastructure aspect. So today, in this presentation, I'd like to describe why we are here and what we are doing about reaching our net zero goals for the island of Gozo. Excuse me. First, I'd like to start off by saying as well that it is vital that the opportunities we are given are utilized in the best possible manner, and we strive for more, project by project, detail by detail. In terms of, it is also important to establish a baseline of where we are at. Risks and vulnerability assessment. By continuous assessment of current vulnerabilities to climate, it is possible to determine how well we are managing the issues now and provide a gauge for how well we might manage future climate change impacts. This is a graphic. Although it turns out to be orange, we lie in the Mediterranean area, and we are hot red is what the graphic is supposed to depict, which is not a good place to be. The greatest vulnerabilities and risks that we face as a Mediterranean island, just below Sicily, is desertification and extreme weather. Again, just for those who are not familiar, Gozo is the smaller island of Malta, still dense, but it is also considered the greener island of the archipelago. In terms of the challenges we face are outdated infrastructure and the extreme storms that I have mentioned earlier, and the capacity of which we are completely not designed for or prepared for. So it is imperative that at all forms of government, at all forms as professionals and as engineers, that we create an ethos is created. So we found the carbon management ethos. Ultimately, the built environment is about better human outcomes, and the commitment to net zero means that embedding best practice social, environmental, and economic sustainability measures in projects to become the bare minimum. A quote I found to be very important. In every sector, in everything that we do, the bare minimum has to take sustainability into account in order for us to reach our carbon management ethos, to reach our net zero goals. Obviously, in having a carbon management ethos for sustainability, there are benefits towards, most importantly, to the environment and to the community. These allow us to offset increasing energy prices, attract project funding for a positive public opinion, increase community satisfaction, risk management, and encourage tourism. And also very important is to increase our resiliency. So how do we achieve our goals? By putting together an integrated design team, which has to occur usually when we discuss integrated design team. It's in the context of high efficiency buildings, but an integrated design team must happen throughout government, through our policy makers, through funding management, through the community, through planning authority, environmental resources authority, and also, most importantly, through engineers. Engineers as leaders rank high on who can make the most positive contribution to society through the projects and through our attaining our goals. So who are the agents of change? Who has the necessary knowledge and skills to inform decision? Who has the responsibility for decision-making and implementation? Who is likely to be affected by the climate risk scope? Who is likely to be affected by the introduction of a particular adaptation action? Engineers have the tools necessary for this. I added a little quote here because I think it's very important in terms of increasing the workflow. We all need to work much harder to make flows between these different entities favor good, sustainable projects. And again, having the engineers at high places and working together and will make everything go much more smoothly, saving time and make these projects much more feasible and a reality, hopefully, in the near future. Where do we have the greatest impact for change? We all know these graphics in terms that the greatest challenges are in buildings, the greatest carbon producers are in buildings and in transportation. The spheres of influence that engineers have the most impact in as well. So basically, the ball is in our court. As architects, as civil engineers, as engineers in general, the ball is in our court to make that change. Our spheres of influence, how do we make those changes? We all know what we need to do. We need to we need to rethink our strategic land use. Malta being an island limited in space and highly developed, land use is essential. Efficiency of space is essential. What we build, where we build it is of the utmost importance. Passive systems and water harvesting. Water, in order to fight against desertification, is very important that when we do have these extreme storms, we collect as much water as we can so we can reuse it instead of from the high developments that we have, allowing the little water that we get run into wastewater from the roads and whatnot. Concepts and solutions can fall into two categories: tweaks and innovation. Tweak, adding insulation, low flow toilets, switching to energy saving lights. Innovation, rethinking the way we design landscapes instead of making more efficient equipment or vehicles. We need to rethink what we do, and we need to do it well again. These concepts that have the potential to relieve environmental concerns and to improve our lives have an architectural bonus, more interesting and creative design opportunities. I'd like to start off by going through several projects that we're doing at the ministry in Gozo. I'm starting off with the smaller projects, a group of 3 projects that I'd like to demonstrate that there's an opportunity in every corner, in every node that can make our environment a better place, a more sustainable place in essence. The first one is in Ala Gozo. It's a very heavily trafficked area that leads to a very popular, one of the most popular beaches in Gozo. This currently, as you can see in the photo farthest from me, it's a traffic area in front of a church that provides no organization whatsoever. It provides some parking, but there's no defined spaces where you can park. One of the proposals we have is by simply reorganizing so that the traffic flows, the vehicular traffic flows know where they need to go, and by the leftover space, we provide grass paving that can lead and filter water into reservoirs, and also in doing so, organize the parking spaces and creating a small little piazza in front of the church, which is to be restored in the very near future. This area has the potential to catch water from various different elevated spaces, which otherwise would rush again into the areas. By catching this water, we can reuse it in our fields and recycle the water, reuse the water for the vegetation to bring up the area around the church. Another urban greening project in Ansilim this time. This is in front of the school of Ansilim, and it is in the very near future to be awarded funding by Ambient Malta. It received very good marks. In terms, it's a small project. We're removing the cables from overhead, putting them under the road. And most importantly, we're taking down what is now, a barrier wall which acts as the entrance to the school, and it's creating an unusable space in front of the school. So our project is proposing to take down this wall and creating a green urban space. Again, we have a reservoir nearby that we can use. We're providing canopies, a green canopy to shelter not only parents who are picking up or dropping off dropping off their kids to school, and providing a green canopy where you have vegetation on the canopy. Small little acts that can be done that are vital in creating a better environment. You can see the corridor, which is blank. This is also the entrance to the village of Ansilim, already a very interesting green corridor before you enter this space. Once you enter the corridor of the school, it gets a bit dry and drab with unusable space. Again, these are the urban spaces we're waiting. We're providing more area for the open space for the public to come wait for their children or just enjoy the area. Some benches, green fencing that will allow the necessary privacy towards some of the classrooms of the school as well. Actually, the auditoriums. And then we get into a slightly larger, a slightly larger project that acts as a catchment. This area is right before the valley that leads to Amjar Harbor. This was subject to very high flooding September of last year because one of the service culverts, the stormwater culverts, got clogged and there was flooding of all the nearby residences. This project we are proposing, and we are approved funding for, to reinstate the stormwater catchment by adding green paving that will filter the water and allow us to collect clean water to new reservoirs. So there's an aspect of water harvesting, and then we'll be able to, from this water harvesting, be able to circulate the water and increase the amount of soft vegetation. Also, another part of this project, or another project which is part of the system, is the playing field in Ansealing, the lower area, where we are increasing drastically the amount of soft landscaping. It's a playing field. We're increasing, making better play equipment and creating more environmentally friendly spaces as well, whilst also providing what is necessary public amenities there isn't in the area, and creating a better spaces for the community. Again, some better description. Some of the green spaces that are added around the area as well. Vegetations at various different levels, various aspects from the beginning to the end of the playing field, where where the water again will be collected in the playing field as well, before it runs into the valley system and then runs off into the Mjar Harbor. A small project at Shat Lahmar, Red Bay in Gozo, just under the Shambra fortifications. This project, this area, I should say, is a very important area in the sense that it's strategically located, as there's a diving site, there's 2 scuttled vessels, and heavily visited by the scuba diving, and it's vital in our scuba diving master plan for the island of Gozo. This project is seeking to create a small little kiosk building where the divers can come, change, rest their tanks, take their showers, and do what they need to do before they go into the sea. Also, this project will provide, unfortunately, there have been various injuries, so it also provides a point of first aid if necessary for diving, swimmers, and bathers that visit the area that's frequented. But in essence, these sort of structures, although it caters to our need, it can be done very strategically and in a very unique way, where we provide solar panels to provide off-the-grid energy and power. There's a reservoir as well to harvest as much water as we can to increase the amount of soft vegetation in the area. Most importantly, though, is even though I mentioned these four small projects, by linking these small projects together, what do we have? We have a very large project that works on a master plan level in Gozo. Again, the links are not only in terms of their design priorities, in terms of sustainable design, but also we are researching, we're doing our work in order to link them through solar paths. So having similar small kiosks where they are connected, you can use e-bikes or bikes, normal bikes, and getting people away from using just the heavily trafficked in an island in Gozo, where these opportunities are very possible. some more slides depicting on the outposts, the solar panels, the small little rooms which provide spaces to cater for the amenities required, reservoirs, and the types of design detailing that we're striving for in all the types of structures that we're doing, in all the spaces, all the infrastructure that we are creating in Gozo at the moment. Decarbonizing Gozo project, the Green Park and Ride. This is a project which we were awarded funding for. It's a concept driven by EU policies introduced for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and other transport externalities, primarily low emission vehicles, the 6 buses that the minister mentioned previously. Switching towards low emissions, alternative energy for transport and efficiency of the transport system. This fleet shall be utilized to transport commuters between the Park and Ride facility and MJAR passenger terminal. It shall operate on a demand basis through a mobile app, and users will be required to reserve their seat beforehand. MGOZO plans to provide such a service from several strategic points to encourage this mode of transportation among the local population. Terminals holding around 25 electric bicycles shall be in Victoria, Massafurin, Schlende, and the new Park and Ride facilities. So essentially, the Park and Ride facility in Tashima, near the racecourse in Gozo, is the first of a pilot project which we are developing as well. And this, I must say, EU policies, which we are catering for, this project has been awarded EU funds. Part of the decarbonizing Gozo project, and the vision of EcoGozo, which has been working tirelessly in order for the sustainable design throughout the last quite a few years. Site selection. When it came to selecting the site to provide this Park and Ride facilities, it was a bit of a task. Again, land use is of the most important, I think, in Gozo, because we are limited in space, and the green space that we have, we don't want to lose it, obviously. We had the opportunity, there were various sites explored through CBA, through heavy analysis, through coordination with Planning Authority and several entities. We located the site near the racecourse, the big green, the horse racecourse, which falls under the local plan, which we can do this sort of project. The existing site was a brown site, or is a brown site. Currently works are underway. We're excavating the large mound that is basically debris, construction debris from when the racecourse was built that was dumped on the site. So what is happening now is we are currently digging the site out, excavating it to road levels, to the levels of the racecourse, the horse racecourse, and where we will be providing our Park and Ride project, which not only caters for the electric buses and various modes of e-transportation, but also is creating large recreational space at the upper levels. This large recreational space caters for a need for families, for sports, in Gozo, where they can come and enjoy not only their day or their families, which is a necessity that is limited, although Gozo is considered the greener island. The places where you can actually go and enjoy these types of activities are very limited. Cars can come, park under the roof deck in the shade, and then take a shuttle with the electric bus towards Amjar, where spaces for parking are non-existent, and they can catch the ferries or what is now available to fast ferries now as well. So public transportation is key. And again, the location of this project is what we'll see in future slides as a second part of this project. It makes sense because whoever comes to use, which I'll present in the very near future, the sports facilities, which we will provide as well, can come and park, so everything is contained. Instead of creating a parking space here and using land use frivolously, we're trying to create strategic master plans where all spaces, all land use are used efficiently. Mitigation is key, visual mitigation, and it was paramount. In sustainability, we're not going for eco buildings, although you might need to squint at this level. The recreational deck, the spaces that we're creating, we're not striving for by far any eco buildings. But what we have is on the lower slide is the existing situation, which already has a brown site at the construction mound and the proposed project, which just creates the recreational spaces similar to the levels which are there today. And now I'd like to take you into the Gozo Sports Master Plans. You might be wondering why I'm bringing Gozo Sports into this presentation. But again, every single building, if all infrastructure works, it's imperative that it goes with the carbon management ethos in order for us to be able to achieve the net zero goals that we have. So these three projects that I'm presenting, which we recently got approved, that will be part of the Small Island Games. We presented these projects and we've got the approval in order for us to create them. One of the projects which the minister has mentioned is under construction and is set to be finished early next year. The other two projects, we are beginning with planning applications and those fun games. The Gozo Sports Master Plan includes the Gozo Indoor Sports Pavilion and Aquatic Center, the Racecourse Outdoor Sports Pavilion, and the shooting range. In designing, in initial concept, sustainability, carbon management is key. Gozo Indoor Sports Pavilion and Aquatic Centers. There's sustainability in operation, in grouping many activities in one space. Instead of spreading different gyms, different, whether it's an acrobatics room, whether it's a multi-purpose pitch, whether it's just creating a pool in a different area. There's efficiency in grouping as much as you can together and making, I'm saying this a lot, efficient use of space. This is the site of what was previously, or what still is, the sports complex. And what we've done is we've rationalized the spaces in order to create and improve drastically the facilities that we are providing. Obviously, in design, there's a lot of elements in design, a lot of engineers from all walks of levels that are included to make what is usually known as a high energy building by mitigating as much energy use as possible. These are the types of spaces that are provided. These visuals are from the original concept. Again, We're creating a 50-meter pool, which has there's different volumes. We have the volumes of the basketball courts, of a new indoor multi-use space, a very large gymnastics area. But the volumes, each of these very large volumes, which are hard to control in regards to heat flow, are compartmentalized to manage these flows and to make the best use of the energy required to run them. The structural elements complement egress and M&E systems whilst creating functionality and storage of equipment, visual connection between existing and new spaces. One of the most important things is obviously when passive design structures is insulation. One of the ways we dealt with it, and in order to make the best use of spaces, is the large amount of spaces are actually underground. And although this can create, if not done well, some very dark areas, we managed to introduce sunlight directly into the spaces which require sunlight. So there's passive, and by including sunlight as well, it allows us to introduce ventilation. So passive systems, even though it's quite a high energy use structure, we've managed to create passive systems in ventilation, lighting, and a high-end or a highly well thought thorough insulation system throughout the structure. Glazing, which also, it's not shown here, I have another slide on it. Glazing is on the north facing wall, which allows us to bring in light without increasing the energy flows to levels that we don't want them to. These are more developed throughout the works. These are more developed renderings. I must put a shout out during in terms of the design flows. In creating these very layered, very designed, these structured buildings, systems, civil works, and whatnot, it is imperative that the communication between the engineers, decision makers is important. We have invested heavily. I think it's part of a design. I consider it a member of a design team. We invested heavily in terms of certain systems, Revit, AutoCAD, obviously, that BIM management. BIM management is essential in doing these structures in order that you can not only come up with the best designs, but you can also monitor. So what happens when we hand over this building, hopefully in the near future, to the person who's actually operating it? It's important that we hand over not only the building, but also how to run the building, what was envisaged, and how to be able to upgrade, and to see where maybe we're not reaching the goals and how that can be amended. So how can that best be done? It can best be done by recording, monitoring, communicating well the design, the design integrity, all the design flows and whatnot by using these BIM systems. We have a small video. This was taken this week to see just how exactly where we're at. Location, again, location is key. The building is located, the existing sports complex, and the proposal is located I think I crashed the system somehow. So, again, this was the first of the 3 projects of the sports I'd like to go into. but it's probably the most complex and the most, the farthest along in the system. The other two, the shooting range and again, the park and ride, near the park and ride facility, are going to see some of the same layering and detailing that we've presented here today. There are many more projects that we are well into, that we are using in order to provide, to get us to our goals for net zero. These include, let me just give a shout out again. We have the petting farm, which is creating more green spaces, more of a Central Park theme. And again, in every single sector that is affecting Gozo, we are instilling this ethos that I've talked about in detail that we are striving for as well. Again, quite a lot of projects, more than I can explain here today, but if there's any questions, please feel free to contact us or at the ministry and we'd love to go through. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for that, Fareed Sultana. We are sorry that we couldn't go through all of the projects. They are very interesting and I'm sure they are provoking a lot of questions in our audience's mind. I would like to now welcome all of the speakers to the top table for a panel discussion. We are aware that Paul Colan will do his presentation later on, but please, if you could join us as well on the stage. Given that we have a hybrid meeting, we will be welcoming questions both from the people here and the people online. So if the people online would like to send their questions via the chat function on Zoom, would be very helpful, and Andre and Maria will help me on the respective Zoom questions. People here, please let us know with a show of hands and we'll come round with a microphone to answer your question. David Schreier, thank you.
Is this working? Yes, it is. First of all, thank you very much for the presentations. Great, Kamrat Al-Periti and the European Council of Civil Engineers for organizing this event with a topic which I think is very apt, very topical and very timely. So thank you for that, and very happy to be here. Allow me to make maybe a few observations for consideration and discussion after having having my own thoughts, but also having heard what was said today, is that 2030, 2050 around the corner. And I happen to discuss this subject in many fora, but this probably happens to be the one I feel most comfortable in because it's in the company of engineers. And of course, as an engineer myself, I would certainly advocate the fact that engineers are probably best placed to be tangible, to be real, not to greenwash, not to be political in the wider dilute sense, but rather in driving change because we are in the company of very intelligent people, engineers. And yes, the world needs as was said in some of the presentations, the world needs much more, certainly needs more intervention and influence by engineers. However, there is a risk, and this conversation and this conference probably did it again, in the sense that, of course, we certainly know what the direction is. We probably know what the risks are. But as engineers, I would hopefully expect for us to measure the risk, to understand the size of the task at hand, and within the main hall of the Chamber of Commerce, maybe say, drive a business plan that takes us from where we are to where we want to be in a tangible manner. Now, we are surrounded by many people who use great words to say we're doing this, we're doing that. And as engineers, we know that relative improvement is not as good as absolute improvement. In a competitive world, relative improvement forward might actually mean that we're moving backwards. And this is something I worry about all the time. And as an engineer, probably this brings the engineer in me when I speak like this. So education is key. We are all learning talent and skills and technology that is happening every day. And whatever we know today is probably outdated tomorrow. As engineers, we love that, but we need to inspire the community out there, especially decision makers, the policy makers, and developers in general to be able to take those actions. We are moving in a direction where technology that is being developed is unknown today, but will be known tomorrow. We're teaching our young kids and our engineers to develop skills to use the technologies that do not exist today, and this we need to be aware of. The rate of change is unprecedented. 2030 is like tomorrow. And I panic, honestly panic, that what we say we want to achieve in 2030, I do not see enough activity to be able to objectively and in an absolute terms take us there. And in a world of engineers, which, you know, as I said earlier, are the ones that contain the most intelligent people and are the ones who are able to measure any action and act tangibly, contrary to many other people that we normally listen to. We should be able to influence change in this tangible, objective manner. Honesty, integrity, doing things right are fundamental values. And yes, it's a tough task, but again, I am aware that we are living, and Malta, living in a world of competition. As a continent, we are also delivering and developing in a world of competition. We have other continents competing with us. Disruption, we're living in worlds of disruption, I'll conclude, is key for us to develop creative juices in our brains. And that is what will hopefully take us there. But we really need to examine every action, every word, every decision, every investment, every way money, finance will flow if we really are going to make a difference towards an infrastructure that will truly make this a better world to live in, a more comfortable world to live in, a more comfortable country to live in, where the ingredients of what nature provides us gives us the ability to live a better quality of life than the one we know. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ferit Shweerap. I'm not sure whether there's anyone from the panel who would like to complement what Ferit Shweerap has just talked about. I've got several things to say, so please don't get me started on the microphone.
Yeah, okay. Can I just say something about this? Because we come back to the climate change and what we want to do. First of all, I have been saying this before, that certainly whatever Malta does, I think even whatever Europe does, climate change is happening. Okay, and it's happening because beyond Europe, there's China and India and South America. And to a certain extent, Europe can tell them, slow down, because, you know. So I think we should be talking a bit more about adaptation to climate change. Now, where does a civil engineer fit into decisions which affect adaptation? To a certain extent, I think civil engineers have to go into politics, because it's in the end, it is the politicians who decide. And the politicians decide on the basis of perhaps public perception. I mean, why is there climate change? Because there were a few number of reports, not the first report. And eventually people started taking these reports seriously and started seeing very, very hot climates and flooding in other countries. So they said, oh, maybe there is something in climate change after all. But I think civil engineering should be looking at the infrastructure that is required come climate change. So Joe here mentioned rising sea levels. How will that impact operations in our harbors, for example? We should be talking about those now, when we should be talking to the politicians to take decisions now. So the only comment I can make is civil engineers have to stop being the technicians and be more about the visionaries, which is a bit what I said earlier.
Thank you, Prof. Bonella, for that. And perhaps I'd like to ask to Kevin Gatt to complement this, because one of the questions I actually had when preparing for this, there seems to be a great divide between who decides and who makes the policy and then the design industry. How can we bring them on the same page? And possibly even from the beginning of a project, there seems to be always the engineer comes towards the end to fix a problem rather than to help design not to have the problem in the first place. So how can we bring these two seemingly very different worlds together?
Well, we could opt for the engineer corrective mechanism now that we have gender corrective mechanism in Parliament, just to ride on Professor Turpiano. But really and truly, what we are pointing to is how governance is actually mainstreamed in order to make these decisions. For governance is not government. Government is a body in itself. But when we talk about governance, it is the actions of all stakeholders which have to be involved at the earliest stage and have to be present in shaping the agenda that will guide a future government's 5-year mandate. And then it will be far more easier to mainstream that once it has been declared as a priority. I truly believe that engineers can make a difference in charting the way government sees development in a new context, in a context which has to start to adapt to climate change now, because climate change is happening. Climate change is not about to happen. Climate change is with us, and therefore the adaptive strategies and the retrofitting strategies which have to go into our existing developments is definitely a challenge, which I would say that only engineers backed by a strong political will and in a participative environment can deliver the goods.
Pizzuto?
I would like to actually touch upon something that Dr. Gatt actually said in his presentation. There was a slide about political will, which I personally found a little bit disturbing, in the sense that the slide said that it's kind of a government is elected on the basis of a manifesto, so that becomes a mandate and there's nothing you can do about it. And I don't agree at all. I think this is not how democracy works. I mean, a government is elected to implement a manifesto, but that does not mean that civil society cannot have its own position which is in conflict with that of a government which is elected, especially when that civil society stakeholders, such as engineers, are technically more knowledgeable than those who are publishing electoral manifestos, and even more so when these electoral manifestos are published without consulting with the engineers. So if we had to give in to this have this fatalist approach, the Camera itself doesn't need to be campaigning for a building regulation system, and all these reforms that we require. We wouldn't need to be discussing climate change because it's up to the politicians to decide. So I think we should have a different way of thinking, and we should be the ones forcing politicians into complying with our positions rather than acquiescing to what the politicians say.
Thank you, Andrea. I think it's always a matter of the link between a top-down approach and the bottom-up approach. And I'm aware that Klaus Trudel would like to intervene here.
Yes, I have a short question to Professor Torpiano. I asked the question after his presentation outside, but I think it's very important for us engineers. Professor Torpiano, are you willing and are you ready to help the European engineers to gain professional recognition? You mentioned the study, European Council of Engineers Chamber has won the tender, and with all the European engineering organization on board, we did a lot of work, and I was surprised you mentioned that, and you said we are very close, and that was right, but we have now a second chance. Mr. Ventislav Petrov from the European Commission asked via email on the 5th of July, we are looking, it was an email on ECEC, we are looking for your opinion on a possible pilot for standardizing minimum training requirements for civil engineers. And that opens the door for a second chance, and I would ask for your help.
Yeah, I think if there is a second chance, I think the chance should be taken, and I'm willing to help.
Thank you very much for that. On the topic of authorities and policy making, I was wondering, Paul, whether you could, from a UK perspective and possibly from other projects that you have worked on, what role do local authorities play? And what are the key challenges that you would like to see in terms of central government policy that would really help to support local authorities in meeting their net zero objectives? Just press the button, yes.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, that's a big question, Jeanette.
Sorry, big people, big questions.
Yeah, well, I think, well, a few observations, and apologies if this is a bit unstructured. I think the first thing that's got to be done is that the totality of the net zero commitments by governments around the world have to add to a solution which gets us to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And at the moment, they don't. So that's the first task at hand, I would say. I think the next task at hand is that the net zero plans have to be real. They have to be implementable. There's been some recent work done which indicates that 2/3 of all net zero plans by governments, city governments, corporates, et cetera, actually do not have the fundamental structures behind them to make them implementable. So if a net zero plan is going to be put out there, then I think particularly for government, municipal government, et cetera, they've got to make sure that those plans are backed up with implementable actions which can actually be delivered. Of course, we then get into the realm of politics and stakeholders, because setting objectives and having plans is one thing, but actually making them happen on the ground is another. I'm delighted to see that Gozo is one of these 100 cities that's pushing towards net zero for 2030 and smart city status as well, I think. And really looking for these 100 cities to be pathfinders to show others what can be done. But it also puts a bit of pressure, doesn't it, on those cities and on Gozo to deliver. And to the gentleman's point earlier, that as we would do in any project, we need to monitor progress, see how we're doing, and if we're not getting towards the objective we set for ourselves, then we need to course correct, make changes, etc. All that's going to be very brave on behalf of people who work in municipal authorities and government, and they'll inevitably bump up against vested interests, against stakeholders who have, other more short-term objectives and priorities and so on. So they're just some observations in the nature of the challenge and the problem, and There's a lot of work to do. But I think the theme of this afternoon's conference, I found it very uplifting, because I think engineers have a huge role to play in keeping, dare I say it, politicians and administrators honest, and keeping them to their plans. So, yeah, hopefully that addresses your question.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you. And perhaps if I may continue on the topic, Godwin, from the Ministry of GOZO point of view, we appreciate that this is the first time that Malta is trying to reach such a target in such a short time. And you've outlined some really interesting projects that will help towards this. But my question is, how will you make, how is the ministry going to be accountable for it? How is it going to make sure that we are going to reach net zero, possibly tying in with what Kevin Gutt was talking about earlier on regarding accountability and responsibility? So how are you planning that this monitoring can be done so that we can really prove that something is a measured success, so to speak? How is the ministry dealing with this?
Just a small correction. Even though it's the first time we've announced our net zero goals, sustainability and carbon management is something that GOZO has been striving for the past, I think 10 years at least, or a little bit less than 10 years. It's something, it's about layers. It's about adding layers, doing something, whether it's a scheme, whether it's a building, whether it's providing a fast ferry service, providing public transport to take away from the amount of cars on the road. It's doing schemes, proposing schemes, doing pilot projects, implementing them, and for the next time, for the next round, doing better. I can't commit the ministry to say that how are we going to be accountable in order achieving the exact numbers. What I can say is that there is lots of dedication, whether it's from the community of GOZO, whether it's from the politicians of GOZO, the politics of GOZO, let me put it that way, and whether it's from the staff, whether it's from EcoGOZO, the strategy and support unit in the ministry that has dedicated their lives to making this work. Whether we achieve it, we are shooting for the moon. There's no doubt about that. And we are getting there. I'm very proud. I'm very proud to see where we've come and where we are compared to the rest of Europe. The projects that we are proposing, that the time was way too limited for me to go into all the details, and I'm just going into the physical projects, the infrastructures. But there are so many other, again, modes of transport that are outside my realm, my sphere of influence, that are being done, that I have great confidence that in terms of carbon management, we are doing quite well. And just to this net zero cities of 2030, there, as far as I know, it isn't a cutoff. I mean, it's not a matter of achieving actual net zero, but it's trying projects and to seeing what works and what doesn't work. And that we are well underway of appreciating.
Thank you. You have some strong targets and strong
Yes,
will to get it done. I'm aware that Umberto Varum has a question from the audience.
Thank you. Sorry. First and all, I'd like to congratulate all speakers for the very interesting, comprehensive, and motivating presentation. I have a very short but difficult question, and I will put the question to anyone of the speakers that would like to do a contribution. My question is related with the difficulty that we are facing now in our society, which is the difficulty of attraction of students of civil engineering in our schools. And this is a problem that in some regions is increasing, and it may be a problem in the future for the society. So my question is, what our society should do in order to diminish this problem and in order to anticipate the problems that this may end up creating in our society? Thank you.
Sure. Are you saying the way to attract young people to the profession, because of that? Well, I mean, we'd have that same problem here. And even though we managed to attract a good number of students towards the engineering discipline, most of them go for structures because it's associated with building and it's perhaps easier and more direct. In the more difficult aspects of infrastructure and water resources, etc., it's very difficult to attract the best students, I think. How to do it? That's a big question. Perhaps I mean, one of the topics we've been discussing in the faculty is some way of internship. So that, because many times as students, they don't know what is possible that can be done in transport, what is possible that can be done in water resources. They know what can be done with buildings because they see it all around. So it's a bit easier to say, this is what I want to do. So I think it's also that aspect of getting young people to understand what these branches of civil engineering are all about. It's also one of the reasons why we try to design a sort of tree structure. So you start with basic and then you eventually find your way. But of course, the industry must do its part to attract them then. So then comes down to a basis of remuneration, status in society. I mean, I made a joke about civil engineers and politics, but our parliament is mainly lawyers. Okay, mainly lawyers. And they've got all the status. You know, if you're a lawyer, you become politician and you can solve the world's problems. If you're a civil engineer, you're probably not interested in parliament, and therefore you don't get a chance to solve the world's problems. So it's a question of status as well.
I think it's a critical question because we have a worldwide shortage of engineers and it's getting worse. I'll give you some sense of what I've seen work. I think the first thing is that we've got to get them young before second level school, because once they get into the second level system, usually they're in a particular corridor or mode of thinking about their future careers. So getting them young, I think, is really important. We've got to make engineering, we as engineers have got to make engineering interesting and exciting, and really communicate, you know, what engineers really do and what engineers can do. And we're not very good at that, fortunately. And this is a whole issue about engineers and communication with you know, in society. I'll mention it later in my talk, but we have got to significantly increase our influence in all sorts of areas. But the positive is, if you get them young and you excite them and you interest them, they will pick engineering. So the challenge really is for us to intervene and put the time and energy into doing that.
And perhaps just to complement what you're just saying, I'm linking what Paul said to what Professor Tropiano said, that I think when we design infrastructure projects, we have to see them from not just the engineering perspective, even though we are engineers. And there are very interesting examples of co-benefit of infrastructure worldwide. I am aware of Tokyo putting a car park over a water sewage plant, for example. And in Denmark, there is a ski slope over an incinerator. So there are ways in which we can make engineering fun and integrate architecture, engineering, urban design in projects that could you know, future-proof them in a way. And perhaps this leads me to a question for Joe. Bearing in mind these co-benefits that can be done in infrastructure, how do you think infrastructure can give something back to society? So we're always talking about how we are going to be designing infrastructure, but how can infrastructure give something back to society and to the community from obviously a marine point of view in your case?
Yes. Once a project is thought well and planned well, and also the proper consultations are done, and its return will be very long term. One can go back to those projects, infrastructure projects, that gave identity to the various locations in the Grand Harbor. The distinction between what would have been a commercial port as from the naval. So already that concentration of supporting villagers in the early three cities that had to be uprooted and transferred, because that is where the support for the maritime happened. And I would dare say that the urban living there was a nightmare. So the fact that a commercial port was developed in Marsa siphoned people from there and brought them, because for obvious logistics, we're talking in the mid-1800s. So people used to live in an area close to their work. So the siphoning of the Borna people that were that were siphoned onto the new Marsa area gave the opportunity for better housing to be addressed in the inner three cities, and also started a concept, Albert Town. It did not really succeed. The British tried to develop the Albert Town in a grid-like, but sort of at that time modern concept. So these projects will have a knock-on effect that will deliver from a social and from a lifestyle. This has to be seen in that context as well. Like besides obviously the economic advantages, like the free port, for example, that the average take home pay of a free port worker, we all know, is about 2.5 times his equivalent. So it's the contribution to the GDP. So there are many knock-on effects.
Yes, and I think we've all seen the projects that are put there with a very good intention, and then are turned up that they could possibly be bad for a community or split a community, for example. I can think of examples in Malta where new roads have been passed through villages or towns and literally have divided the two towns, such that, unfortunately, in that case, the infrastructure has not given back. But perhaps if I go to Kevin, I appreciate that you may want to also answer Andre Pizzuto's question of the political will. But maybe if you can combine your answer to answer this question as well in terms of the urban infrastructure to complement Joe's marine.
If I could put Andres' mind at rest, that when I talk about political will and the validity of a mandate, my argument has been that political will is not just the politician's domain, but it is up to stakeholders to try and shape that mandate. And in doing so, facilitate the interaction that you can have then when the government is implementing that mandate. And I also made the case that we need engineers to be in the policy, in the regulatory, as well as in the operational sectors, so that they can translate these into action and into something which makes sense. Perish the thought that a mandate is cast in stone and is not subject to dialogue. It is simply the unwrapping of a series of proposals that, if those proposals are already shaped by the various professional organizations that represent engineers, architects, and what have you, then when the mandate starts to be unfolded, these proposals can be much better implemented, would have much more readiness, and would facilitate the incorporation of stakeholders in fleshing them out and implementing them. As regards to benefits, you mentioned on the urban infrastructure, this is something which actually we are trying to explore as much as possible with our upcoming master's students. And we're trying to see what people think, because finally we do have public perception to contend with, and to what extent they understand what green infrastructure, for example, really means, what well-being it can bring about, what economic benefits it can bring about. This is not something of a tree-hugging movement which is seeking to recommend the greening of our urban areas, but it is a scientifically proven and engineered intervention. It is there to imitate the principles of nature and to reverse the effects that a development would have had if these measures were not in place. So we are trying to establish, for example, how willing people are to walk that extra mile through a pedestrian area and forfeit the parking space behind their doorstep. We are looking at, for example, understanding how economic operators view parking in a different way, parking which involves multimodal systems and which does not depend on passing traffic. We are looking also at seeing whether people understand the difference between investing in healthcare facilities against using part of that money in order to invest in a healthier environment. And this is the prevention and cure debate. To what extent are people willing to have part of the investment which goes to curative care being diverted towards preventive type of care? And we have the evidence, scientific evidence, that shows that nature contributes to well-being. Mental well-being has risen to the forefront of the agenda. It is no longer a taboo, and it is openly discussed, and it is linked to certain chemicals which the body can generate itself without the use of too much medication or complementing existing medication through simple recreative activities. So I think this is the matrix of options, which I said every project should be designed with a number of options which are screened in order to determine which of those options gives us or maximizes economic, social, and environmental goals, impacts, and well-being.
You have mentioned there a question that I try to stay clear of, rather controversial, at least in the Maltese context and the elephant in the room, about whether we should keep designing for the car in our cities. But I will leave that perhaps to the networking and coffee session later on, because we're running a little bit behind schedule for today. So I'd like to thank the speakers once again for their time and their knowledge that they've shared with us today. And in the same breath to welcome Paul Cullen for his presentation now. So Paul Cullen is a chartered civil engineer who is currently Group Chief Operating Officer for Arab Group, an independent firm of designers, planners, engineers, architects, consultants, and technical specialists. Paul ran Arab's business in Europe between 2014 and 19, managing the firm's operations in 10 countries. He ran Arab's business in the Netherlands between 2012 and 15. Throughout his career, Paul has managed projects and has provided advice to clients in the aviation, highways, and rail sectors. Particular expertise has been gained in project management, design management, contract administration, safety management, strategic consultancy, and risk management in those sectors. Between 2006 and 11, Paul was project director on the Dublin Airport Terminal 2 project in Ireland and managed the Arab team that guided the project through to opening in time in November 2010. Thank you so much for being here with us today. And you'll be speaking about the role of engineers in leadership positions. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Jeanette. And it's lovely to be back in Malta. The current chaos in the Europe aviation industry did its best to try to prevent me from getting here, but I eventually got here at 3 a.m. this morning from London. Great to be here and to be with you all. As Jeanette alluded to, I'm here wearing, I guess, 3 hats. I'm a chartered civil engineer, chartered by the Institute of Civil Engineers. I'm also on the executive board of ECE, and it's great to see ECE having such a successful event here. But I guess my day job, the job that pays the bills, is my role as Chief Operating Officer for Arab Group. And as Jeanette was saying, I'm going to be talking about engineers as leaders in the current climate, so to speak. And I'll try to, if you like, articulate some of the views and ideas I have through, if you like, my experience of running the operations for Arab Group. So, slideshow, perhaps. Here we go. Yeah, so the title is, and by the way, I do realize I'm between you and coffee, so I'll try to speed up and keep it short and sweet. And actually, it's been really interesting that many of the things that I'm going to mention today have already been mentioned by the other speakers. I think what it tells me is that the engineering profession is actually now really discussing the things that matter, and I think that's a very strong first step to solving some of those challenges. So it's a bit of a mouthful, but I think it's important. Some of the words in the title of the talk are important. Influence, I will come back to towards the end of my speech. I think is hugely important. We've covered that already in some respects. Outcomes, I think, was a kind of an underlying theme of a lot of what was alluded to today. And leadership that engineers can give. I think engineers need to be a lot more active rather than passive, and I'll explore some of those themes as well. Okay, I have to do some work here. So, very good. So I'm going to refer to, I've put this presentation together based on 3 documents, some of which are quite recent. And I would actually certainly commend the first 2 of these to all of you to read if you haven't done so already. I've been reading recently the latest reports from the IPCC I'll mention those in a moment in terms of the content. It's pretty sobering stuff to the comment made earlier. The middle one there is a report commissioned by the Institute of Civil Engineers and published in November of last year called Engineering Rebellion, which I think gives a flavor for what it's proposing, which is, change, radical change in how engineers are developed, trained, and so on. And the third document there on the right is a document that we just published in Arup, actually this week, which is an influence plan for our company, because we realized over the past 2 years that we're not going to have the influence we want to have unless we have a properly resourced and backed plan to do it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a while. So some of you will know that the IPCC is currently publishing its 6th set of assessment reports. So I think the 5th set was published just before the Paris Agreement, like in 2014. They're publishing now. They're going through the publication of the kind of the technical reports, if you like, before they publish their overall report later this year. The one I've been reading is the report that's just come out in April, which is about mitigation, which really focuses on what progress we're making in terms of reduction in emissions and removal of CO2. And I'm going to refer here briefly to, for those of you who read the reports, they can be a bit heavy reading. So the World Resources Institute website, which I would recommend, has summarized the findings, I think, quite well. The first one is that we're rapidly running out of time to keep to 1.5 degrees. I think I mentioned that earlier. In fact, the IPCC say that we've got to start reducing emissions before 2025 if we're going to meet 1.5 degrees target. That's less than 3 years away. I think you'd need to be extremely optimistic to think that we can get there. So it's not looking good. But that's what they've said. And I guess that reflects, if you like, the report card for the world's governments, for the world's companies, for all of us in terms of the progress we've made. We're basically not doing enough. And it looks like we're going to miss 1.5 degrees centigrade with all of the implications that has. There is some good news buried in the detail. The rate of increase of emissions has slowed down in the last decade. So between 2000 and 2009, it was increasing at about 2.1% per annum. And between 2010 and 2019, just before the pandemic, the rate of increase had gone down to 1.3%. So actually, there's progress, but it's not quick enough. And as I said earlier, the national climate commitments made by the governments, the very latest climate commitments, still do not, when you add them all together and look at them, they still don't help us to get to the 1.5 degrees. They're not ambitious enough. And as I also said, they're not real enough. So it's a real challenge we have in front of us. There are some rather unpalatable findings in terms of what we have to do. We basically have to stop building new fossil fuel infrastructure. Even the existing and planned fossil fuel infrastructure that's currently on the books means that we don't achieve 1.5 degrees, staying within the 1.5 degrees limit. So there's a huge task for engineers and everybody else to mitigate the impact of fossil fuels. We must retire existing infrastructure, cancel new projects, retrofit, and look to carbon storage and capture technologies. The company I work for, Arup, decided late last year that we were going to stop working in projects to do with hydrocarbon fuels. So we did that in April. We basically decided to say goodbye to 1/3 of our global energy business and just stop working on those projects. And I think, we collectively have got to bite the bullet and stop working on and investing in and delivering new hydrocarbon infrastructure capacity. The other findings, I want to come to finding number 3, which is about the transformation that needs to be made to systems, which I think really interests engineers. But the other findings I thought I'd mention briefly. I think this is the first time the IPCC have looked and made comments about lifestyle, as in our lifestyle. They've said that the top 10%, the 10% wealthiest people in the world, and I would reckon that all of us here are in that top 10%, contribute between a third and a half of all global emissions in terms of our lifestyle choices, what we decide to do. So they're now appealing directly to people to change their lifestyle, because they realize they've got to do that if we're going to have any hope of meeting our targets. There's been a lot made about green finance, finance for mitigation projects, but they think we're underpowered by a factor of 3 to 6. So we need 3 to 6 times more green finance, particularly on projects in developing countries. And the other thing that they've said we need to do is we need to start removing carbon. So we're now past the stage where we can not take that option, which means building more carbon sinks like forests and so on, but also look at technological solutions. So it's all a bit sobering. But I focused on the opportunity because that gives us room to play in as engineers. So there are 5 things that I picked out from the report that I thought were really interesting. The first one is about energy. We've got to move to clean energy. We've been doing some work in terms of trying to assess the level of reconstruction or modernization of energy infrastructure that's got to be done to achieve the green energy transition. It is enormous. It is huge in the developed world, but that is a huge opportunity for engineers to work on exciting projects that really make a huge difference to the future. And most of the technology we need to do this is here. So, and the cost of the technology is actually well within reach. So, for instance, solar power photovoltaic technology has reduced, it's now 15% of the cost it was 10 years ago. So huge progress in renewables, the cost of doing renewables that can be taken advantage of. The other thing they've said is the need for innovation, circular economy approaches, and actually in that respect, the European Union is leading the way globally in terms of circular economy principles and espousing those and making them real. The other really interesting area is zero carbon buildings. Lots of progress over the last 5, 6, 7 years in zero carbon building design and construction, but we need a huge amount more of it. And this again plays to skills and capability in engineers in the built environment. Another thing that Arup has done from April is we've committed to measuring or doing whole life cycle carbon assessment of all of our building projects, whether they're new or retrofit. And we're going to use that to refine design techniques and design approaches to push carbon loads down on new buildings and retrofit. Transport is the other huge area, and Jeanette alluded to it, the role of the car, the role of the internal combustion engine. Lots of good work has been done on the 15-minute city or the 30-minute city, depending on which part of the world you're in. I think the view that this is difficult and too difficult to do has been, I think, very much challenged by what's happened over the last few years, because in many respects, we have learned very quickly to work and live without the things that we thought we couldn't live and work without during the pandemic. So again, huge opportunities to do things there. And then finally, the whole ecosystems and food systems side. I thought I'd show this slide, which is a piece of work that Arup did and publicized recently called Sponge Cities. So this was an articulation using artificial intelligence and land use planning tools, give a sense of how spongy cities are in terms of ability to deal with the impact of increased temperatures and other impacts, more intense rainfall events and so on. Interestingly, we looked at 7 cities globally, Auckland, London, Mumbai, Nairobi, New York, Shanghai, and Singapore. And the best city in terms of being spongy and having the biggest green footprint was Auckland, New Zealand, at 35%. And guess which one was the worst? London, 22%. So lots of work, lots of opportunity to improve cities, make them greener, help them to be more resilient to climate change going forward. I want to come now to the ICE report, Engineering Rebellion. And for me, this report, it's well worth reading. This is my well-thumbed copy here that I carry around with me. Quite a radical report in many ways, because it basically says we've got to completely reskill engineers for now and the future. And the declaration it makes there, I think, is pretty stark. Achieving net zero carbon and the wider SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, is not just a technical challenge for this generation, but a moral challenge. And I think if we had our Q&A back again, Jeanette, then we could talk about morality and climate change, but I certainly agree with that sentiment. So the report includes what it calls 7 disruptors. So these are things, and disruption is a fashionable term at the moment, but it challenges in 7 areas around skills for civil engineers. And I'll talk a little bit about them in terms of personal experience within the company that I run, which has 17,000 people globally and probably about 10,000 engineers across the globe. The first disruptor is that net zero and sustainability benefits will become central to project outcomes. So we're at the foothills in terms of the skills and capability we need to be able to really make this real on projects. Huge amount of training and skilling up to do, which we're heavily investing in, and I know lots of other organizations are also doing so. So that's certainly a big ask, and I would of course encourage discussion about to what extent we're really incorporating net zero and sustainability thinking and skills into education for engineers and into ongoing CPD. The second is around business models. It's become increasingly obvious that you've got to look across the whole project lifecycle to make meaningful impacts. Whereas in a lot of cases, our engineers are focused on one particular part of the lifecycle. For many of us, it's design or construction, but increasingly the beginning of the project in terms of feasibility and scoping, and then the operation of the project and its demolition or bringing out of service are hugely influential in terms of the overall impact of the project on the environment. I was very interested to hear some of the views today about education, accreditation, regulation, etc. of the profession. What is also critical is to increase, and the Engineering Rebellion report makes this point very strongly, increase the diversity of the profession. We are not diverse enough as engineers, and it's not just about gender. It's about culture, it's about skill set. It goes back to the point earlier that I made in response to the question about encouraging people into engineering. We still have too narrow a type of person that comes into the profession, and that's a weakness for us. We need to really work on diversity. Digital, I think you'd be forgiven for being a bit tired of telling you about digital skills, but actually, particularly around the use of data, data will help us to solve a lot of these problems that we have in front of us. So skills in data science, data analysis are absolutely essential for engineers going forward. And unfortunately, and I speak personally here, there are generational realities about digital skills. For people, for more senior engineering professionals, it's not necessarily about skills to do the coding and so on, but it's the understanding and skills to promote the increasing use of data analysis, to understand what lies behind it. And then for younger people, they're coming along with these skills from their training, from university, from their life, and it's supporting them to develop those skills to make a difference. Innovation, I think, is the word that comes out of number 5. This again is a huge issue. We have just done a global staff survey, and one of the big findings from the staff survey was, are people telling us that we do not give them enough time to think and innovate, which is a huge challenge for us because we normally pride ourselves in giving people time to do that. But they're telling us they're not getting enough time. We're too focused on the now. We're not giving enough time for them to problem solve and think outside the box. I think this is a must for engineers going forward. Innovation is about a mindset, a culture, rather than training, I think, for the most part. So that's a big challenge. And system thinking, are engineers good at system thinking? I think we think we're better at system thinking than we are, if I'm honest. Most of these big challenges around climate change have to be solved on a systems basis. Again, the question earlier from a gentleman who's no longer with us emphasized the fact that we got to look at the overall picture and then really drill down to see what the impact is on particular projects. And the last point is about lifelong learning. We are past the point where you do your learning in university, and then you do your 37.5 hours of continuous professional development per year, and you tick the box and you move on to next year. I think certainly from my own experience, and I'm sure many of you as well, you know, we're now having to go back and learn new skills, spend a lot more time studying what's going on, because the rate of change of the reality of the environment in which we work in is increasing all the time. And what's expected of us is also more. I wanted to talk about leadership through influence briefly before I finish. And I put this definition up because I think it's an interesting definition about what influence really is. It's an act that produces a progressive change in the world around us. And I like the words large or small. So it doesn't have to be huge. It can be small. It can be, you know, one step, one action, one influential conversation, one intervention on a project. On a personal level, it's about, you know, being confident to be an advocate for change. And at a corporate level, I don't mean just being companies. This can be governments, municipal authorities, etc. It's about, you know, putting the values and ambitions into action to produce real change. So we've had to think about what this means to us, because, as I said, we wanted to be influential, but we realized after a couple of years of implementing our corporate strategy that we weren't making much progress. And the diagram here on the right, I think, is a good expression of that. We generally tend to try to be influential in the stuff on the bottom left-hand corner, what I describe as the comfort zone. So there are existing networks or relationships, whereas actually what we need to get to is this very networked influence, which will take us out of our comfort zone, because we'll have to stand up and say things and be advocates for change, get in the face of politicians, you know, challenge our clients, et cetera, in a way that we're not used to, and some of us don't have the skills to do. So in terms of the areas where we can make a difference, the supply chain that we work in, whatever that is in your particular line of work, for us, it's about sub-consultants, collaborators like other architects and professional engineers, but also clients. The markets and networks, so it's getting outside of your contractual relationships and being heard in your market, and sometimes being a bit brave in your market and doing something different, or even investing your own money in doing something that's progressive. Advocating for change with other organizations, NGOs, academia, and so on. So again, getting outside your comfort zone. And communications was a big theme of today. I think engineers are generally, if I could make the sweeping statement, we could be much better at communication. We've really got to up our game on communications, because however good our message is, the message is only 50% of the task. If you can't communicate the message, then all of that effort and that positioning goes to waste, because you're not cutting through, if you like, to the people that you need to get through to. So we've 4 areas and invest heavily over the next 3 to 5 years in them. Where am I? Yeah, skills, because we have to continue to invest in skills. But the big thing that we've got to change amongst our people, and I think globally within engineering, is mindset. So this switching from being happy to stay in our comfort zone into a mindset where we feel responsible and have a duty to make a case for progressive change. Influencing clients, collaborators in the market. I spoke about that already. Getting out there, talking to people, putting yourself out, being influential in our community, our communities. Again, getting outside of our comfort zone, and then thought leadership. So again, one of the themes of personal experience, discussions at conferences like this over the past 2 to 3 years, and we covered it earlier in respect of politics and how you get change through politicians, is that we need to be better at getting our thought leadership to make a real difference in civil society and in politics. We're generally quite poor at that. We got to find ways of actually, making the interventions at the right time, whether it's in the writing of manifestos, or in considering other potential opportunities for making a difference. So I'll sum up. For me, the challenge is huge. If we didn't know how much of a mess we're in, we know it, I think, now, again. The opportunity for us is there. We have many of the solutions, and we can bring many of those solutions to bear on projects and in the world around us. We've got to lead. I think we've got to lead through skills transformation. We've got to take responsibility on ourselves to up our game in all of these areas of new skills that we need. And we've got to lead through influence. We've got to get out of our comfort zone and make a difference. So that's it. Thank you all for listening. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for those insights. We're towards the end of the conference today, so I'd like to invite both presidents, President Andrea Pizzuto from the Camerata Periti to close off the conference, and later President Andreas Bradner to close off the 74th ECHE General Meeting.
So we are almost at the end. So thank you all for coming. I hope this was a good experience for you. 2 years since we last met in person, and I hope it has begun to make some fruitful outcomes for you, particularly when it comes to the regulation of the profession. So hopefully the conclusions of the workshops we had yesterday can be brought forward for the next general meeting in Vienna, and you can make some progress as an organization.
Dear Mr. President, dear colleagues, I would like to say thank you for being here. I would like to say thank you to the Camerata Periti here in Malta, because they did a really tremendous job. We decided by beginning of May to hold this event in person, and they were willing to do it. Thank you all in your staff, especially thanks to Jeanette And also thank you to Maria, our General Secretary. She just recovered from COVID, and I was very happy when I heard that she will come to assist. Thank you. And yeah, I would like to say goodbye to you all, not to our colleagues. We will see us at the dinner, but to all other friends and interested colleagues who came to the Beyond Infrastructure. It was a very interesting afternoon, and I hope we can get the presentations also for our colleagues in ECHE. So thank you once more. And now there is some free time to recover. Thank you.
Some housekeeping notes. On the outside, just outside, we've got some teas and coffees so that we'll be able to catch up and have a word or two. May I please attract your attention to end posters that are towards the end of the hallway here. These are projects that have been submitted for this year's thesis projects by the second year students of structural engineering. And there is a small book stall that Kite Group have set up with a selection of architecture and engineering books. President Bratner would like to present a copy of the notes on history of civil engineering to our speakers today, and perhaps I can't see Perry Godwin anymore, but I'm sure that we will be able to give him and the minister who joined us online a copy, and I will forward one to Kevin Gatt at university. For all those who are going to be joining us later on this evening for the gala dinner, may I please remind you that it will be held at the Hotel Grand Excelsior in the ballroom, and it will start at 8 o'clock in the evening. All those who are joining us for the cultural tour tomorrow will be also meeting at the Excelsior at 8:30 in the morning, and we will go on foot to the Archbishop's Palace, which will be our first destination in the morning. Thank you so much.
Recording stopped.